The witch. Where did it come from? Why does it have magical powers? And is it really that evil? Millions of years ago, a terrible disaster had struck the overworld at the ancient cities, and most of the ancient people were killed. However, there were some that were able to escape. Most notably, the villagers. But these escaped villagers were confused and lost, and so they spread out all across the world. Eventually, when things began to seem safe, these villagers started to construct small towns to live in. And it was within these small towns that the villagers had a perfect place to live. They could farm peacefully, they could create elegant stones, and they could just overall be very happy. And that's how it was for millions of years after the original disaster. Except not quite, as there was one deadly problem that these villagers faced every night, and it threatened their entire existence. You see, every night, the deceased from their past civilization would rise from the dead, and they would attempt to attack and convert these alive villagers into one of them. But luckily, the villagers had defenses against the zombies, mainly in the form of the Iron Golem, and so for most nights, the villagers would be safe from the zombie siege. But sadly, that wasn't always the case, as some nights the zombies would be able to get into the villages and convert all the villagers into zombies. And so all these new zombies would be forced to leave their homes and join the attack for the next village. And well, because of these constant attacks, little progress could be made within the villages. And so it made sense that these villagers were quite desperate to find a cure. A cure that would either eliminate the zombies or allow for the healing of the infected villagers. And so for many months, all the different villagers would meet in the town centre trying to think of ideas to do that. But each meeting would end with very little success. But one day, that would all change, as the clerics reminded everyone of a place that they could go that may have the items that they needed to get rid of their undead problems. And well, that place was the nether. You see, back in the long gone days of the ancient cities, the ancient people had actually discovered the nether, and it had been used as a place to banish their enemies. But that was all millions of years ago, and so it was likely that all the nether creatures had either died, or the knowledge of how they got there had been lost, which meant that in the cleric's mind, it could be safe to go there looking for these exotic new items to fight the zombies. And so the clerics devised a plan. They were going to send some of the bravest villagers to the nether. Then those villagers would go out and gather all the rare exotic new items that they could possibly find before returning back to the overworld, where the clerics could then, using their knowledge on plants and basic magic, create the items they needed to defeat the zombies. Sounds like a great plan, but there was a slight problem. No one wanted to go to that deadly dimension. And so the clerics were forced to take things into their own hands, and as such, many decided to venture into the nether for themselves, a decision that many would regret. You see, the nether was far more deadly than they had expected, and as such, many of them died due to the harsh environment. But those who survived pushed on with their exploration, finding many exotic plants and fungi, just what they had come for. But just as they were planning to leave, something caught their attention. There was a massive structure in the middle of this deadly world. Maybe the lost civilizations had built it before they died out, or maybe this was a trap. Regardless, they, being curious, decided to investigate. But what they found were just large, abandoned fortresses. Now, while they may have all been abandoned, they still contained quite a few useful items, such as the nether warts. But most importantly, it was there that they found strange glowing rods, known as the subscribe rods, known as the blaze rods. And well, since these fortresses were empty and they were safe from the hostile environment, these villagers decided to do some experiments right there and then with the items that they had found. Mainly with the blaze rod, where very quickly they were able to create blaze powder as well as the magical brewing stand. However, at that time, they weren't able to make very many potions. But on the bright side, they had found many different exotic plants that could be experimented on in the future that could allow for the defeat of the zombies. And so, feeling like they had gathered all that they needed, they returned back to the overworld. But once they had done that, something very strange occurred. The abandoned fortresses suddenly became populated with the nether civilizations, as they had all been hiding before. You see, they had all been hiding after a terrible disaster had struck them not too long ago. But when they all reappeared, they saw that some of these dead clerics weren't actually dead, but they had been severely injured from the harsh nether environment. And so, after seeing that these clerics weren't a threat, they decided to save them. But once they asked these strange creatures why they were there, and once they explained their situation, the nether civilizations also wanted to help. First, they gave them new robes to wear, as the old ones were mostly burned and destroyed. Also, they gave them a brand new hat to cover up any other damages that they had sustained on their head. But the nether civilizations wanted to do more than just make these damaged villagers look better, and so they wanted to teach them magic, as that way they could defend their threat themselves. And so, for the next few months, the nether civilizations taught these clerics a lot on magic, spells, and potions, until eventually the nether people thought that the clerics were finally ready to go back to their home and make a difference. And these better trained clerics, by the way, well, they were the witches. Anyway, the witches were sent back to the overworld, and the first thing that they did was they went back to the villagers to show them all the amazing new skills that they had learned. But the response they got was one of disgust, because just as the witches were trying to show off what they had learned, they were interrupted by the villagers, who didn't want to know anything about the witches, as these weren't really villagers anymore, they were ugly magicians. And so, before even being able to properly explain anything, these witches were forced to leave their towns. But as discouraging as that may have seemed to the witches, they believed that they could be accepted back into the villages if they could find a cure for the zombies using their magic. However, they didn't know how to do that just yet, and so they started to experiment. But if they wanted to experiment safely, they were going to need a laboratory, and so they ventured to the coldest biome, the tundra, to build these labs, as that way there would be very few mobs to deal with while experimenting. Also, to truly make sure that no one else would go inside their labs, they built them underground, underneath small camouflaged igloos. And it would be from these labs that they would experiment on the infected villagers from the destroyed towns, trying to find a cure with their magic and their potions. But for many years they were unsuccessful, and they started to think that maybe even with all this magic, there just wasn't a cure. But then one day, they found it. Using a combination of a weakness potion, as well as the rare golden apple, they were able to cure the villagers. This was the happiest day of the witches' lives. This would be the day that they would finally be accepted back into the villages. And so they went back to the villagers, showing all their people this amazing cure, but once again, they just didn't want to hear it. They didn't trust the ugly witches. Hearing that was devastating for the witches, as they had just spent years working trying to help the villagers just to be rejected from them. This truly angered the witches, and so they decided to abandon their laboratories and all their research they had done, and they decided to go to a place far away from any villagers. They went to the swamps, and it was inside these swamps that they would start plotting their revenge. They started out by infusing their magic into the fungi that they had collected, in an attempt to create an all-powerful new mob that could be used to crush the villagers. However, that didn't quite work out, but they did have another idea. Still using the magical fungi, they could infuse it into an already existing mob to create a very powerful servant. And that mob they chose, well, it was the magma cube. The reasoning for that is that it was one of the more common, yet still very powerful, nether creatures. And so the witches went back to the nether, and they gathered as many magma cubes as they possibly could, and they returned them to the swamps, where later they were infused with the magical mold. And so that's how the slimes were created. But there was a slight problem with these slimes. They weren't willing to serve the witches. But not to worry, that could all be fixed in one spell, if only the witches could cast it. You see, just as the witches were about to cast that spell, they were interrupted. And because of that interruption, their spell was corrupted, and bad things started to happen to the slimes. First, most of these slimes that had just been created were thrown out all across the world in random chunks. And when they arrived, these slimes melted into the ground, transforming the chunk that they had landed on to become an area of slime creation. And then the other half of the slimes became soulbound to the swamps and the full moon, meaning that they could only be summoned at full power during the full moon in the swamps. And the worst part of all this, they didn't even become servants of the witches. But now, who interrupted the witches' spellcasting? Well, it was the evokers. You see, the evokers had been watching this whole time, but they didn't want to interfere until they saw that pure anger and hate that brewed inside the witches when they created the slimes. And it was then that they knew they had to act, or else the witches would become a force too strong for this world to handle. And so the evokers stopped the witches from casting that spell, and they gave them another way to get back at the villagers without destroying the entire world. And that was to join the group of the Illager Raiders. Surprisingly, most of the witches accepted this. As for those who didn't, well, they now either wander the world aimlessly, or they continue to live in the witch hut, experimenting alone. And so, at least for today, the overworld was safe. But there was another dimension out there that wasn't so lucky, as it was being. Watch this video to find out how the end was destroyed.